A very good evening and welcome to another episode of South Africa Today and Beyond. In the studio this evening, I'm joined by the Deputy General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Comrade Mapaila. Comrade Soli, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Cora.
I think the audience at home sitting there, they see you as a leader of the Communist Party, but they don't understand the man or they don't know the man. Perhaps take us through how you got involved in the South African Communist Party to ultimately also lead the organization and what really attracted you to communist teachings and philosophies.
Well, firstly, I met the Communist Party underground when I was a student and youth activist. We were asked to distribute some leaflets at the time, including banned literature of the Communist Party, the newsletter we call The Worker or Umsebenzi, as well as the African Communist. But those leaflets, in the main, particularly the African Communists outside, to have nice drawings, for instance, of flowers, how to do gardening, those kind of stuff. So those were fascinating times. Those were banned literature. So we will be asked to distribute them. I was in the Agitprop, which is agitation and propaganda unit of our underground structures, where we used to distribute leaflets, spray paint messages, particularly around major campaigns. Of course, centrally to that was the continuous call for the unbanning of our movement, the release of President Nelson Mandela, and of course to give encouraging messages about the role of MK, the trade union movement, the harassment that was going on at the time, to continue to share solidarity messages through our unit. So as a consequence of that, we were then made to listen to Radio Freedom. And it was after listening to Radio Freedom at one comrade, who's late, Comrade Mjalafa Mahlasela, who was actually the man that brought me into MK, essentially. And he created this impression that Radio Freedom only existed at his house. Because we used secretly to go there and sit and listen. So when whatever we're listening has been finished, then he switches off. So we realized, gosh. So there was no impression that you can receive it later somewhere until they started giving the indications where you can find it. Then we'll write them down inside your hand, in your palm, So you can also sometimes try to listen to it at some point. So this then attracted us, myself in particular, to the SACP. And in particular, we began to learn more about some of the stalwarts of the movement at the time, who were then interlinked with both the SACP and ANC work, as well as trade union work. And later on, when I was outside, I was then officially recruited into an SACP unit. And that's when systematically was introduced to the theory of dialectical materialism, the philosophy of Marxism, the theory of society, the theory of class struggle, and all of that. So, and I found that effectively, all that we have been fighting for back home was just about the general political ideas, but that effectively the oppression will continue for as long as we don't deal with the system that reproduces these inequalities and oppression, the real system that creates oppression beyond the general oppression of political oppression of movement, freedom of speech, all those kind of things, but the system that creates social and economic oppression, which is the capitalist system. And that's what attracted me much more, because I wanted to inquire much about this philosophy that begins to unearth the rot in this system of capitalism that makes people unequal. And on that particular basis, one of the fundamental theories in our liberation movement with regard to what our struggle was about, which was, they will say, it was about to resolve three interrelated contradictions and problems in a way. One was the problem of national oppression, the problem of racism, where the majority of Africans, Indian, colored, communities who were classified as blacks were under oppression by a white minority. So the struggle for national identity, which of course goes beyond just racism, it's also about national sovereignty and so forth, was an important area. Then was the question about resolving the contradiction of gender inequality, wherein women suffered the patriarchal system that were embedded particularly in the African communities, but also generally in South African community, where male domination was the rule of the day. So that is the reason why in our revolutionary movement led by the ANC or headed by the ANC, we began to talk about a struggle within a struggle, which was that in the struggle for national liberation and in the struggle for gender equality, women were twice as much oppressed as men, or more oppressed as men. That's why we also called it the triple oppression of women. We also were fighting, or that contradiction was explaining the class oppression of society, which is now in the economic struggle, wherein we were now able to be introduced to the realities of South African economy, who owns what and what led them to own what and who works for who and so forth. In that regard, we're then seeing the inequality generated by the system of capitalism that created the divisions, in this case applied across these three main contradictions. So the capitalist system in the class form creates the class of the rich and the poor, and in this class of the rich and the poor, the majority of the poor are black Africans and women. And the same in the gender system, you find that in that order, the most oppressed within in gender form will be black women instead of black men. So the system was too anti-women. So that theory assisted us to begin to engage, but then of course I was much more attracted to the class one, which wanted to remove the whole foundation of oppression.
Now, Comrade Soli, let's talk about the relationship of the SACP to the state in a democratic South Africa compared to during the apartheid era. You spoke about the banning and the banned literature as well. And I suppose that's indicative of the kind of antagonistic relationship the Communist Party of South Africa then had with the state.
Yeah.
But perhaps characterize for us the current relationship the South African Communist Party has with the state today. Well,
yeah, that's important. Let's start there by just saying, without explanation, that the South African Communist Party was the first political organization to be banned by the apartheid government through an act of parliament which they passed called the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950. That completely outlawed the Communist Party as an organization, and all our members were therefore banned, and therefore they had to leave the organization. And later on they will use this act to stop any other liberation fighter, those in the trade union, the ANC, and in other organizations. They will just waive the Suppression of Communism Act to impose a banning order on individuals. But with regard to the current relations we have with the state, is that we are part and parcel of the state system, so to speak, in a way that we are part of the ruling ANC party as a liberation movement, which is now ruling as a political party in government. We are part of that as the SACP. So in that regard, we don't necessarily have an adversarial relations with the state. We have rather a complementary relations with the state. We want the democratic state to succeed in its mission to serve the people of South Africa and to transform our society from all these three contradictions of race, class, and gender, which continues to bedevil our society. And of course, subsequent problems that are attached to it. For instance, the problems of deepening poverty, deepening inequalities, and that are reflected in these three categories. So we have, if you like, a love and hate relationship in a way that whilst complementary to the state and government, we are also mindful that we are an independent political organization as a Communist Party. So we run campaigns. Effectively, on record, basically for a fact, is that we're the only party in this country that has more political campaigns than any other party, in fact, than all of them combined. We run a series of campaigns all the time, whether it's about public education, public health. We're the one that actually fought for the NHI, for instance, before it was actually embraced by the ANC as a policy. We were on the streets fighting for it. We've been fighting for services in our campaign we launched in 2005 called Know and Act in Your Neighborhood campaign, which talks to basic services, water, sanitation, transport, and other basic necessities. So some of these campaigns have to be directed at government, but we have largely confined the sphere of our campaigns to engage big capital. Our predominant campaign has been the transformation of the financial sector campaign, which highlighted, for instance, the negative role of the credit bureaus, the lack of transformation by the banks who collude with the credit bureaus that actually are selling people's houses, evicting people in their houses and reselling these houses for 10 rand or 100 rand, something that could have actually be negotiated with the owners. But you could see the brutality of the system. So we have run some of these particular campaigns, but we will then also take memorandums to government, because government has the regulatory capacity to intervene and engage with the sector that actually oppresses people in that regard. So we have that love and hate relation. Sometimes we march, and the content of the march is not really taken into consideration. And then we propose harder measures. Then they listen to us, that kind of stuff.
Sure. Comrade, I want us to go for a quick ad break. When we come back, I want us to discuss the challenges that face the Communist Party today in a democratic South Africa, but also your relationship or response or attitude to some of the emerging social movements globally and also here in South Africa. So let's go for a quick ad break and we'll be back. Welcome back from the ad break, and in studio we're still together with Comrade Mapaila from the South African Communist Party. Comrade Soli, I mean, before the ad break, you're talking about the relations of the South African Communist Party with the state. But maybe take us quickly through some of the challenges that the South African Communist Party today is facing as a political organization compared to some of the challenges that you had to face as an organization during the struggle for liberation in this country.
Yeah, the most difficult part, obviously, is that the struggle for a socialist South Africa, it's a struggle that has been too much left to the intellectuals, has not been very much simplified. So some of the campaigns that we've taken, for instance, the campaign for public education, public health, public services, those kind of struggles were meant to embolden and actually create more awareness about collectiveness and the role of the public institutions and the public sector. So it's a very difficult task, because necessarily it is not seen as being involved in a communist struggle as such. People want, if you want to be involved in a communist struggle, to talk for the demise of something instantly. Which is not the policy that we have adopted. For instance, we will not want capitalism to exist as a communist party. But the reality is that it exists. In fact, 70% of South Africa's economy is in private or capitalist hands, so to speak. 30% is in public hands. So the reality is that we live with the capitalist system. We live with generations that have never even had to compare socialism and capitalism on the one hand. They've only known the capitalist system, the education system, and all our learning platforms, majority, have actually been exuding the system of capitalism. And therefore, people who participate in it, including those who become like CEO of some corporations, big companies and so forth, they see that as a measure of success. Whereas, Tina, we in the Communist Party, we see it as ascending to a platform of oppression. Now, to go out and say that will be undoing the value of socialism in a way, because people don't actually dismiss socialism. So that's the biggest challenge we have, to create a balance of the necessary awareness and development of mass consciousness about the need for socialism, and therefore explaining the rot of the system of capitalism that has failed humanity all the centuries that it has ever existed.
Now, commercially saying what you're saying now, let's look at the emergence of social movements and how you say, you know, the generation, and I think my generation, and being born into the capitalist system that you speak about. Now, the emergence of these social movements like Fees Must Fall that are demanding decolonized free education, your Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and other similar movements as well. How do we begin to interpret that in the context of what you're saying?
That's very important. In fact, let me start more with the section that I've known you to be active about, the BDS movement, for instance. The BDS movement is deeply ingrained with communistic values of solidarity, empathy, internationalism. So it's a very important area, aspect of work. That is why, for instance, the Communist Party has also been quite active in the BDS movement, because of our internationalism. And because of our solidarity with the Palestinian people and all other oppressed people all over the world. When you take, for instance, the Black Lives Matter in the US, we have actually been engaging with them, including with the Occupy movement in the US. Those are good fellows of mine. We interface quite often. We have met in different conferences all over the world. And they've been inspired by some of our campaigns we've been undertaking as a Communist Party. You will also see that, for instance, if you were to take the Black Lives Matter, it's within the sphere, in our case, of national liberation, of national identity sphere, of the fight against racism. Because that's where the black people, on the basis of the color of their skin, are being targeted by racist fellows in the security apparatus in the US and so forth, to an extent that people have to establish a movement to protect the color of the skin of individuals. And of course, non-black people join the movement because of their empathy and solidarity and internationalism. So the social movements are very important in the life of society, and also in the life of a political movement. For instance, we would not have found a possibility to raise the value of internationalism, for instance, if the BDS is not actively involved in leading the struggle for international solidarity. So there's complementarity in terms of many struggles of the people. For instance, the decolonized education struggles are very important struggles for us, but we must locate them within our conditions. For instance, in our case, we talk about colonialism of a special type, so that when you fight for decolonization, you are not anti-white per se. Because, for instance, if you are anti-white in South Africa, your struggle will not be relevant, because there are white people who have been here for over 500 years in terms of generations. How do you take away the birthright of those who have been here, who know any other generation except the generations that grew up here? So the decolonized form as an anti-imperialist posture of the struggle becomes important. So we must construct it within the relevance of our conditions in South Africa to make it an effective liberation education that is based on the values and aspirations of the people of South Africa.
Now, Sali, let's talk about, I think, in terms of, and you talk about issues of internationalism, and I think it's about solidarity among human beings in general, and ultimately the development of human beings in general. But let's talk about the development of people, the development of cities, and how communist teachings and communist philosophy can feed into that. And I think that a classic example is what we're seeing now. These social movements attempt to bring a better life, a better society, better communities in which we live in because of the oppression that we are interfacing with every single day. Now, how do you believe that these communist teachings and philosophies can then feed into ultimately a better world?
Of course, these teachings are teachings that first have eliminated the artificial ideas about the barriers that, for instance, between men and women, between colors of people or pigmentation, as we may say it, So they go to the root cause of what is human. So the central value of the communist system, it's humanism. Any communist society that loses that can't be associated with any notion of communism. So therefore, those struggles are critical and very important in that for as long as they weave together the commonness of the human species, of the human beings, that becomes important. Then we can develop new societies based on that. That is why part of one inspiration, apart from what we have condemned, the destruction of public property, for instance, which is common property, by the way, was the solidarity amongst the students across the color lines. That for us, it's an important value for the construction of a new South Africa in line with building an unracial society. So those struggles have shown us those aspects, and those are areas that we must consolidate and build upon, because South Africa, the future of South Africa depends on it.
Now, Comrade Soli, you talk about, the solidarity among students, but also let's talk about how we can take those who are in a position of privilege and take them from where they are to where we would like them to be, in terms of also realizing that in as much as they're in positions of privilege, they need to recognize the sufferings of other people. And I think that's where solidarity within societies and communities, but also that cuts across color lines, comes from. How do we take people from that place of privilege? And I think we've seen some, even in the South African case, during the struggle for liberation, you had white people that said, look, the comrades like the likes of Comrade Ruth First, Joe Slover, that said, look, in as much as white people were privileged to some extent because of the way the makeup of the state, but we understand the suffering of black people in this country, and we choose to be on the right side of history. So how do we then in conclusion, take those in the position of privilege to where we want them to be?
That's a very important question. In fact, one of the influences of those comrades like Slovo, Ruth First, Ben Einstein, and others to come on board and be on the side of the oppressed black majority was because of their humanism. And they could recognize any wrong thing done to another human being, irrespective of the color of their skin. And that finally, they've also admitted the main system that oppresses the people and the tool that the racist government of apartheid was using to oppress the people, and they decided to fight against that. So building an egalitarian society of equals will be a difficult task, but a critically needed task that will not necessarily rely only on the sporadic gestures of those who are rich, but you will require the change of the entire system, the foundations of the system. Because, for instance, you will not necessarily have to change Soweto to be like Sandton to say we've built a better Soweto. You need to change the lives of the people of Soweto for them to have access to food, to have access to better facilities, and all of those things. Once you do that, they will not aspire to leave Soweto to come and stay in Sandton. And also the people in Sandton, they can easily visit Soweto without seeing it in a slum form. So that project is going to take for quite some time, but it will have to be based on fundamentally changing the structure of our economy that reproduces the poverty, the inequalities, as well as the segregation that we continue to see in our society.
Thank you so much, Comrade Soli. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on the show. Thank you so much for coming through. And thank you so much to the viewers at home for joining us. Have a good evening.